Okay, I think it's a really useful thing to consider that the history of management studies is itself a relatively short field. It's important to understand that essentially prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was no concept of productivity, no concept of management. Very little rules set down as to how success was garnered. And so the beginning of management sciences as a social science really kind of kick starts with the great social philosophers of the end of the 1800s. So essentially with Karl Marx and Emile Durkheim and Max Weber, all of which are seeking to understand how the world has changed since the Industrial Revolution. So if we start with Karl Marx, so 1872, he publishes Das Kapital, and his key thing is essentially to say that the Industrial Revolution has changed the way in which society operates. So essentially, the development of modern technology, the move towards factories, towards production lines, has increasingly made the worker unnecessary. And thus, in kind of moving them into a smaller sphere of influence, allowed for them to be considered part of the machine, part of the means of production, which essentially can be controlled by the bourgeoisie. But that the values in which we operate in, the kind of capitalist rules which we all perhaps ascribe to, are part of the problem. They are propagating a value system, a hegemony, which allows for people to be oppressed. 1892, Emile Durkheim's division of labour equally comes back to this idea that essentially it's the technology that exists after the Industrial Revolution which defines the world of work. So Emile Durkheim is interested in essentially the division of labour. So his idea is that modern technology has taken people from having a large sphere of influence over everything in their life to increasingly being placed within a very kind of small part of the bigger kind of puzzle. And that being increasingly focused on one particular thing, one particular task, is relatively alienating and leads people to essentially struggle with a concept about who they are and to the idea of anomie or formlessness. So he's interested in how the world of work is created in such a way which counteracts that, how the uniforms that people wear, the rules in which they operate with, the way in which meritocracy is supported, counteracts that idea that people feel like they're not in control of everything anymore. And then 1984, Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and Spiritual Capitalism is slightly different from the two, as in he seeks to understand that rather than think that the world of work is defined by the technology in which we operate with, he seeks to understand people in order to explain the social institutions. So rather he believes that the Protestant idea that everybody's striving to get to heaven, and as a result wants to equate success within on earth with an increased likelihood that they are going to go to heaven, means that people essentially try hard within work and seek success in order to be able to show others their godliness, so to speak. So those three key philosophers are essentially interested in why work exists. And it is quite philosophical. Why work exists? Why does it control people's world? How is value ascribed to certain acts? How is reason established within an organization and by proxy within the market? And that's essentially where the history or the real beginnings of management science as a theory exists. So the first business textbooks, so to speak, or the first business school only opens in 1889. And Wharton Business School is opened by Joseph Wharton, who makes his money through Bethlehem Steel. So Joseph Wharton works with Edward Taylor, who is later referred to as the father of scientific management. And it's important to say that prior to this, he says that there's no management per se. Within his own operations, gang leaders essentially control the speed at which people work. And so productivity is of factory operations is somewhat unheard of prior to the 1880s. But the growth of certain types of individuals propagates a kind of an interest in explaining how they make money. So he sets himself up in 1882 with Wharton, basically in order to talk about his success and how it's moved on. And it's important to say that in the late 1800s, some people are making a lot of money very quickly. In fact, the first kind of crunch point we have is essentially 1904 with the Standard Oil crisis. So Standard Oil essentially is an oil refinery company owned by John Rockefeller, which by the time that we get to 1904 owns 91% of the production within the US and 85% of the sales market. It's one of the first large global monopolies. And there's an expose written by a lady called Ida Tarwell in the New York Times, which basically shows how the operations of Standard Oil influence pricing within the market. So it underprices and cuts out its competition, but essentially gives favourable deals to other parts of the business, which it's kind of vertically integrated to exist. So whilst essentially it digs the oil at the ground, it essentially also owns shipping and railroad companies that move it around the world and around the country. It owns the refineries and it owns the pipelines. And so it controls pricing essentially within the market. Now the problem is that Standard Oil essentially made its money initially through productivity. Whilst other companies used to consider gasoline to be a byproduct of oil production, Standard Oil was one of the first companies to essentially power its machines through it. It's essentially created Vaseline. It used to make money out of things which people threw away. But by 1904, its actions are essentially brought to a close by the US government suing them under antitrust legislation. And this essentially seems the breakup of one of the world's largest monopolies into a number of companies which we still know now. So the company's influence in the market is so substantial that it's broken into a series of state-based subsidiaries. So Standard Oil in New Jersey goes on to become Esso. Standard Oil in New York essentially becomes Mobil. And in California becomes Chevron. So a series of these very successful companies still exist to get at today. So 100 years ago, people are beginning to discuss how capitalism is not necessarily always good and how the unfettered growth of certain businesses can damage people. But it's important to say that at this time, we're still not necessarily talking about business strategy. Up until about 1930s, I guess, there's no concept about business strategy per se. There's success within an organization, but that's largely thought to come down to standardization, rules which you can operate or put in within your business. And so business strategy is broadly broken down into two schools of thought. There are prescriptive theorists, people who subscribe to the positioning school or the design school or the planning school, who believe that your business can succeed by following a series of rules. They may differ as to what those rules will be, but this idea is essentially quite prominent up until the late 1960s and still has a large number of proponents. And then those people who fall into the descriptive school, who say that success within business is more related to specific environments you operate, or doesn't operate entirely in the same way within every business, who say that one of the problems about how you solve questions about business is about how you seek to explain or understand the environment in which you operate. So the descriptive school are as interested in how people understand strategy as a discourse, as a means by which people are identifying what they think are the major problems within their business, as how they are actually solving it. So things like the learning school, the power school, etc., are seeking to understand that strategy, in contrast to a kind of traditional scientific problem, when your business is going down, one of the problems with business strategy is essentially that there's no kind of clear idea about what the right or the wrong thing to do. Is because essentially the actions in which you operate, the choices that you make within the market, have an equal reaction to them. And there's very little idea for kind of trial and error, so to speak. So descriptive schools understand that essentially business is a wicked problem, so to speak, which, as Joseph Ritter would describe it, as in essentially something which cannot be considered to be kind of run specifically within a kind of test tube environment. And so they're interested in how that operates. Okay, I'm going to disappear now. I'll let you spend some time making your way through the timeline. I'll pop back at one or two particular times, but largely to explain how the macro environment has affected how businesses work, and in particular moved forward business strategy as a thought process. It's important to understand that how business strategy is taught nowadays is very different from how it was taught 20 years ago. If you have any questions, I look forward to being able to answer them